The official record on the 30 construction workers who vanished from a remote worksite in 1939 was thin, a historical anomaly left unsolved. It was the tail end of the Great Depression, and the accepted theory was that the men simply walked away, another group of souls lost to the era's desperation. For 65 years, their families were left with this hollow explanation until a demolition crew hundreds of miles away in Queens broke through the concrete floor of an old parking garage. What they found would prove the 30 men were silenced for something they witnessed, and that the organization responsible was still burying its secrets. The sweat gathering on Elias Vance's upper lip was the first true thing he'd offered all afternoon. It was 2004, and the air in the NYPD interrogation room hung thick and stagnant, smelling of burnt coffee and the metallic tang of fear. Detective Kalen Paxton watched the man across the scarred, bolted-down table. Vance, wiry and restless, was beginning to disintegrate under the accumulation of his own lies. Kalen had spent the last 2 hours methodically dismantling the alibi for a string of violent bodega robberies. He was close. The confession was palpable, hovering in the suffocating air, waiting to be seized. "Let's talk about the jacket, Elias," Kalen said, his voice low, a steady pressure applied to a stress fracture. He leaned forward, eliminating the distance between them. "The security footage from the deli on 4th? The shooter is wearing a very specific red and black North Face, the exact same jacket we found stuffed in the back of your closet." Vance flinched, his eyes darting toward the one-way mirror, seeking an escape route that wasn't there. "That ain't mine. I don't know how that got there." "And the witness," Kalen pressed, twisting the knife, "the elderly woman with the poodle. She saw you running. She recognized your face." The facade finally gave way. Vance's defiance evaporated, leaving behind the desperate, hunted look of a man trapped. He opened his mouth, the truth trembling on his lips. The heavy door behind Kalen clicked open. Kalen ignored it, locking eyes with Vance. "Tell me what happened. Make this right." A presence moved into his peripheral vision. Captain Daria Wallace. Wallace didn't interrupt an interrogation unless the city was sinking into the Atlantic. "Detective Paxton, a word, now." Her tone was clipped, leaving no room for argument. Kalen felt a surge of frustration, the tension knotting the muscles in his neck. "Captain, I'm right on the verge." "Now, Detective." Kalen stood slowly, his instincts screaming. He gave Vance a final, hard look. "Don't even breathe." He followed Wallace into the hallway, the heavy door sealing the silence back into the room. "What is it?" Kalen asked, rubbing the fatigue from his eyes. He was seconds away. "Vance can wait." "You're being pulled. Reassigned immediately," Wallace said, already moving down the corridor. "A situation in Queens, an old parking garage off Northern Boulevard. They were doing demolition, prepping for new condos." She stopped and turned. "The crew struck something under the foundation. Lowest level." Kalen waited. "Struck what? Toxic waste? An old septic tank?" "They're not sure. But it's significant, and it's homicide's jurisdiction. Forensics is rolling. I need you on site, as primary." The drive to Queens was a congested crawl. Kalen's mind struggled to shift from the focused intensity of the interrogation room to the unknown chaos of a demolition site. He arrived at a hulking concrete monolith, a relic of a bygone era stained with decades of city grime. The site was already buzzing. Uniforms had established a perimeter, keeping the construction workers and early onlookers at bay. Kalen ducked under the yellow tape and followed the sound of generators down the ramp. The air grew colder as he descended, thick with the smell of pulverized concrete and something older, damper, the smell of unearthed soil. The lowest level was vast and desolate. The yellowish glow of the remaining overhead fluorescence reflected off the gray concrete, marked with faded parking lines. Concrete pillars receded into the gloom like silent sentinels. The activity was centered around a massive excavation machine, its hydraulic hammer now silent, standing over a gaping wound in the floor. Kalen approached the site foreman, a burly man whose face was pale beneath a layer of white dust. "Detective Paxton, NYPD. Walk me through it." The foreman pointed toward the hole. "We were breaking up the foundation for the new pilings." The concrete was way thicker than the blueprint said. Then the hammer hit metal, screeched like hell. Kalen stepped to the edge. The hole was jagged, a brutal rupture in the concrete, revealing the dark earth beneath. And then he saw them. Large 55-gallon industrial barrels, heavily corroded, their metal surfaces crusted with dark red and brown rust. Each one bore a distinctive, faded blue band around its middle. Some were still half buried, lying at awkward angles in the dirt. Others had been pulled out. "We figured it was industrial waste," the foreman continued, his voice shaking. "Companies used to bury their trash back in the day. We started lifting them out." He pointed to a barrel sitting apart from the others. A dark, viscous substance had leaked from a rupture in its side. That one, the rust had eaten through. When the machine lifted it, it cracked open. Kalen walked toward it, his heart rate accelerating. The smell intensified, not just rust and earth, but something else, something sickly sweet and heavy, the unmistakable odor of decay. He crouched down. The metal was brittle, flaking away under his gloved touch. Inside, compacted within the dark, muddy interior, it was difficult to make out details. But then the floodlights shifted, catching a glint of dull white. Kalen's breath caught. Embedded in the compacted earth and decay was the unmistakable curved shape of a human skull. The empty eye socket stared back at him, a silent scream from a makeshift grave. The sight of the skull instantly changed the air pressure in the garage. The localized confusion of a construction mishap crystallized into the grim, heavy reality of a major crime scene. Kalen stood, his gaze sweeping the underground space, reclassifying it not as a demolition site, but as a tomb. "Shut it all down," Kalen ordered, his voice slicing through the sudden hush. "Nothing moves, not a machine, not a person. This is a homicide scene. Expand the perimeter," he told the nearest uniform. "I want this entire block sealed, and get the ME's office down here. Tell them to send everyone." Within the hour, the underground garage was transformed. The harsh glare of the floodlights illuminated a flurry of organized activity. Kalen stood near the edge of the pit, coordinating the efforts, but his mind remained fixed on the skull. How long had it been entombed there? And how many more were waiting in the dark? Dr. Lena Hansen, the lead medical examiner on site, joined him. She surveyed the pit, her expression professional but grim. "Well, Kalen, you certainly know how to clear a schedule." "What are we looking at, Lena?" "A logistical nightmare," she said, adjusting her mask. "These barrels are incredibly fragile. The corrosion is extensive. Extracting them, without compromising the contents, will be agonizingly slow." She gestured into the darkness of the pit. "And it's deep. There are many more down there." The extraction began. It was a painstaking process, requiring specialized slings, braces, and a small crane brought down the ramp in pieces. The teams worked with the precision of archaeologists. Each barrel was lifted slowly, the rusted metal groaning in protest, threatening to disintegrate with every movement. As each one was placed on the concrete floor, the true scale of the discovery began to emerge, horrifying in its implications. 5 barrels, then 10, then 15. Kalen watched as the line of blue-banded coffins grew longer. The silence in the garage was broken only by the scraping of shovels and the quiet commands of the forensic technicians. The air grew colder as the night deepened, the dampness seeping into Kalen's bones. This wasn't just a crime, it was an atrocity. There was a cold, calculated efficiency to it, burying bodies in barrels, pouring tons of concrete over them. It was a secret engineered to last an eternity. Near dawn, the excavation was complete. The pit was empty. Kalin walked down the line of barrels, counting them one by one under the flickering fluorescent lights. 30. 30 barrels. A mass grave hidden beneath the feet of unsuspecting New Yorkers for decades. Lena Hansen approached him, pulling down her mask. Her face was etched with fatigue. "We've done preliminary examinations of the opened barrels." "The remains are old, Kalin. Decades. The concrete actually preserved them to an extent, but the corrosion caused significant damage." "Timeline?" Kalin asked, his voice hoarse. "Not definitively, but based on the decomposition and the materials, we're looking at 50 to 70 years. The time frame hit Kalin hard. This wasn't recent. This was history reaching out from the grave. Identification? It's going to be tough, Lena admitted. Identification will rely heavily on dental records, if they exist and if we can find them. Kalin immediately turned his attention to the history of the location itself. He needed to know when the secret was buried. A team dispatched to the Department of Buildings returned hours later with the original permits. The parking garage was constructed in the late 1930s. The foundation was poured in October 1939. 1939, the tail end of the Great Depression, a time of upheaval, desperation, and organized crime, a time when people could disappear easily. Kalin stood amidst the silent barrels, the weight of history pressing down on him. 30 souls, lost to time, now demanding answers. He waited anxiously for the first identification, the first name. He didn't know why, but he sensed that this case felt different. It felt personal, as if the ghosts of the past were calling out directly to him. The following days were a grueling exercise in patience. The barrels were transported to the medical examiner's office, beginning the meticulous, grim process of examining their contents. Kalin found himself caught in the administrative whirlwind that accompanied a discovery of this magnitude. The city was obsessed with the blue barrel graves, and the precinct was inundated with calls, theories, and desperate inquiries from people searching for relatives lost to time. Kalin remained focused on the identification. Until they put names to the remains, they were investigating shadows. He needed a starting point, a thread to pull. It was late on a Friday afternoon when the call came. Kalin was buried under a mountain of historical missing persons reports when his desk phone rang. It was Lena Hansen. "We have a hit," she said, a hint of professional excitement undercutting the gravity of the news. "Barrel B12, remarkably well preserved. We charted the dental work, extensive bridge work, very distinctive for the era, and cross-referenced it with historical records from the state archives." Kalin sat up, grabbing a pen, his pulse quickening. "Who is it?" "Male, late 30s. Matched a record from a clinic in upstate New York. The name is Silas Griffin." Silas Griffin. A name, a history. When did he disappear? September 1939. 1939, the same year the foundation was poured. The timing was precise, chilling. Kalin immediately began cross-referencing the name, filtering the database for 1939. The results loaded almost instantly. But it wasn't a single report. It was a cluster. "Lena, I'm looking at the report now. Silas Griffin didn't disappear alone." He scanned the file, his eyes widening as the details coalesced. Silas Griffin was one of 30 construction workers who vanished simultaneously from a remote state park lodge construction site deep in the Adirondack Mountains. 30 men, 30 barrels. "Lena," Kalin said, his voice barely a whisper, "I think we just found the lost crew of the Adirondacks." The incident was a historical anomaly that had baffled investigators for decades. 30 men vanishing without a trace. The case was notorious and never solved, suspended in time as a dark footnote in the history of the Great Depression. Kalin opened the full case file, digitized from the original microfiche. He scanned the list of names, the details of the investigation, the theories that had circulated for decades. And then he saw it, a name on the list. Bernard Paxton. Calen froze. The blood drained from his face, the air rushing out of his lungs. The room seemed to tilt. He knew that name intimately. Bernard Paxton was his grandfather. He closed his eyes, the implications washing over him like a tidal wave. His grandfather, the man who had been a shadow in his family history, a ghost story whispered at reunions. The man whose disappearance had broken his grandmother's heart and haunted his father's entire life. He had always known his grandfather was part of that lost crew. It was the family tragedy. But he had never imagined that he would be the one to find him, buried in a barrel beneath a parking garage in Queens. He realized with a sickening certainty that he was investigating his own grandfather's murder. The professional detachment he had cultivated over a decade in homicide shattered, replaced by a raw, visceral connection. The 30 barrels were no longer just evidence. They were family. He walked to Captain Wallace's office, the case file clutched in his hand, his mind reeling. Wallace looked up as he entered, her expression serious. Calen, I heard about the Adirondack connection. This is huge, the historical significance alone. Captain, Calen interrupted, his voice thick with emotion. He placed the case file on her desk, open to the list of names. He pointed to Bernard Paxton. He was my grandfather. Wallace stared at the name, then at Calen. Oh, Calen. I need to stay on this case, Captain, Calen said, the initial shock giving way to a cold determination. I need to be the one to see this through. Wallace nodded slowly. The personal connection complicated things, but she recognized the unique motivation it provided. I'm keeping you as primary, but you need to handle the notifications personally. The Griffin family. They deserve to hear it from someone who understands. Calen nodded, a grim sense of purpose settling over him. He was no longer just investigating a mass murder. He was bringing his grandfather home, and he was going to find the people responsible, no matter how deep the roots of the conspiracy ran. The drive to the Griffin family home in Brooklyn was the longest of Calen's career. Notifying the next of kin was always the hardest part of the job, but this wasn't a recent death. This was the reopening of a wound that had festered for 65 years, a confirmation of a loss that had defined a family for generations. He parked in front of a modest, well-kept house. A porch swing moved gently in the breeze, a touch of normalcy that felt jarring against the horrific reality he carried. He knocked on the door. It was opened by a man in his late 40s with a tired face and eyes that held the weary suspicion of someone who had carried the weight of the past for too long. Mr. Griffin? I'm Detective Calen Paxton, NYPD. He held up his badge. I'm here about your grandfather, Silas Griffin. The man's eyes widened, the suspicion replaced by a sudden, raw vulnerability. He stepped back. Vaughn Griffin, you found something? Yes, sir. We did. Vaughn led Calen into a living room filled with photographs, artifacts of a long family history. An elderly man sat in a recliner, a blanket draped over his legs. He looked up as Calen entered, his eyes sharp and clear. Dad, this is Detective Paxton. He's here about Grandpa Silas. Otis Griffin, the son of the man who had disappeared, struggled to sit up. He had lived his entire life under the shadow of that mystery. Calen sat down opposite Otis. Mr. Griffin, a few days ago at a construction site in Queens, we discovered remains. We've identified one of them as your father, Silas Griffin. The silence that followed was profound. Otis stared at Calen, his eyes filling with tears, his breath catching. He didn't speak, but the emotion that washed over his face, a mixture of grief, relief, and a profound sadness, spoke volumes. A lifetime of uncertainty collapsed into a single moment of painful clarity. Vaughn, however, reacted with anger. He paced the room, his hands clenched into fists. Found him? Where? After 65 years you just found him? Buried under a parking garage? He was buried, Kalen said quietly, along with the others. The entire crew. Buried? Vaughn stopped pacing. You mean murdered? They were murdered and disposed of like trash. Yes, we believe they were murdered. Otis finally spoke, his voice trembling. I always knew he didn't just leave us. He was a good man. He wouldn't have abandoned his family. Who did this? Vaughn demanded, his voice raw. Who killed them? And why did the original investigation fail so completely? We don't know yet, Kalen admitted, but I promise you, we will find out. You better, Vaughn said, his grief transforming into a desperate need for justice. This isn't just some cold case. This is my grandfather. I understand, Kalen said. He paused, needing to forge a connection, to let them know he wasn't just a detached investigator. There's something else you should know. My grandfather, Bernard Paxton, was also part of that crew. He was found with your father. The revelation hung in the air, shifting the dynamic. Vaughn's anger dissipated, replaced by a look of understanding, a recognition of their shared trauma. The inherited grief forged an immediate, unspoken bond between them. Otis motioned to a side table. Vaughn, bring me the box. Vaughn retrieved a dusty wooden box and placed it on the coffee table. Otis opened it with trembling hands. Inside were artifacts of a life interrupted: a worn leather wallet, a pocket knife, a few faded letters, and a photograph. Otis handed it to Kalen. It was a faded, sepia-toned black and white photograph. It captured a group of about 30 men posing at what appeared to be an industrial construction site. They stood under the exposed steel skeleton of a large structure. All were dressed in the uniform of manual laborers, durable overalls, heavy work shirts, and worn caps. Their faces were weathered and unsmiling, their expressions uniformly stern and serious as they stared directly into the camera lens. They looked tired, etched with the lines of hard work. Not a single man was smiling. That's them, Otis said, pointing a trembling finger at a man in the front row. That's my father. Kalen studied the face of Silas Griffin. Then he looked at the other faces, searching. He found him in the second row, standing tall, his arms crossed over his chest. Bernard Paxton. It was the first time Kalen had seen this particular photograph of his grandfather. He felt a surge of emotion, a connection to the past that was both painful and profound. I need to be involved in this investigation, Vaughn said, his voice resolute. I can't just sit here and wait for updates. I need to do something. Kalen looked at Vaughn, recognizing the same restless energy, the same need for justice that propelled him. I'll keep you informed, Kalen promised, every step of the way. He left the Griffin house with the photograph clutched in his hand, a tangible link to the past and a renewed sense of purpose. The investigation was no longer just a case. It was a crusade. The photograph became a talisman for Kalen. He pinned a copy above his desk, the stern, unsmiling faces of the 30 men serving as a constant, silent demand for justice. The identification of the remaining victims proceeded slowly, confirming what they already knew. The barrels held the entire Adirondack crew. Bernard Paxton was officially identified 3 days later. With the identities confirmed, Kalen turned his attention to the past. He needed to understand how a mass murder of this scale could remain unsolved for 65 years. He requested the complete case files from the State Archives in Albany. The files arrived in several large, battered cardboard boxes, smelling of dust and decay. Kalen sequestered himself in an empty conference room, spreading the documents across the table. He spent days immersed in 1939, breathing the stale air of the archives, reconstructing the events through the brittle, yellowed pages. The original investigation, he quickly realized, was superficial at best, bordering on negligent. The files were disorganized and frustratingly incomplete. The official narrative was flimsy, a patchwork of assumptions and convenient theories that crumbled under scrutiny. The construction project, a grand state park lodge deep in the Adirondack Mountains, was overseen by a powerful company called Adirondack Summit Development. Even during the Depression, they wielded significant political influence. When the workers vanished, Adirondack Summit Development swiftly deflected the blame. They claimed the men were employed by a subcontractor, Mountain View laborers, who were solely responsible for their safety and whereabouts. The subcontractor conveniently went bankrupt almost immediately after the incident, their records vanishing along with the men. The prevailing theories were absurd. Accidental death, 30 men falling into a mine shaft simultaneously. Mass desertion, 30 men abandoning their jobs and families without a trace, leaving behind their belongings and paychecks. It read like a calculated cover-up, aided by the chaos of the Depression. The authorities, overwhelmed and under-resourced, seemed to have accepted the official narrative without question. But as Kalin dug deeper, he found cracks in the facade. Buried within the files were the handwritten notes of the original lead detective, Thomas O'Malley. O'Malley's notes were cryptic, fragmented, but they hinted at a different story, a story of suspicion, obstruction, and fear. ASD owners stonewalling, O'Malley had scrawled in the margin of an interview transcript. Refusing access to the site. Witnesses intimidated. And then Kalin found a note that sent a chill down his spine, despite the stuffy air of the conference room. Suspected organized activity. Rumors of forced labor at the camp. Need to investigate connection to... The note ended there. The ink faded. The rest of the sentence lost to time. Organized activity. Forced labor. This was the first hint of a motive, a reason why 30 men would be silenced so brutally. O'Malley had suspected the truth, but he had been powerless to pursue it. The files painted a picture of marginalized workers, exploited by a powerful corporation and silenced when they became inconvenient. Kalin closed the file, the dust motes dancing in the afternoon light. He understood how the crime had been concealed, but the why remained elusive. What had the workers seen or done that warranted such a brutal execution? He needed to go to the source. He needed to see the place where it happened. But the official investigation was moving slowly, constrained by bureaucracy. He needed someone who understood the urgency, the desperation. He picked up his phone and dialed Vaughn Griffin's number. "Vaughn," he said when the line connected, "I need your help. We're going to the Adirondacks." The official investigation felt like it was moving at a glacial pace. Vaughn Griffin knew Detective Paxton was thorough, but the man was bound by bureaucracy and protocol. Vaughn, however, was not. He was fueled by a restless energy, a burning need for answers that consumed him. He couldn't just sit still while the wheels of justice slowly turned. He needed to see the place where his grandfather had taken his last breath. He didn't tell Paxton. The detective would try to stop him, warn him about interfering. But Vaughn didn't care. This was personal. He packed a bag, grabbed his camera, a digital model, new in 2004, and started driving north toward the Adirondack Mountains. The drive was long, the highway giving way to winding mountain roads, the cityscape replaced by the dense forests and towering peaks. The isolation was profound. He felt a growing sense of unease as he drove deeper into the wilderness, the beauty of the landscape contrasting sharply with the darkness of the history he was uncovering. He arrived at the State Park Lodge late in the afternoon. The lodge, now a historic landmark, was a magnificent structure of timber and stone overlooking a pristine lake. It was beautiful, serene, but Vaughn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. This place was a monument built on the bones of his grandfather. He checked into a small motel and spent the evening studying the old maps from the case files, locating the site of the original workers' camp. It was several miles from the lodge, deep in the wilderness. The next morning he set out early. He hiked through the rugged terrain, the air crisp and cold, the silence heavy and expectant. He felt the weight of history pressing down on him, imagining the men living and working here, far from civilization, far from help. Their vulnerability was staggering. He found the site of the camp. It was overgrown, reclaimed by nature, but the remnants of the past were still visible. The foundations of the barracks, the rusted remains of a stove. It was a desolate place, haunted by the ghosts of the past. He walked through the ruins, trying to reconstruct the events of 1939. He tried to imagine the fear, the desperation. He spent the entire day exploring the perimeter, looking for anything that might have been missed by the original investigation. He found nothing. The wilderness had swallowed the secrets of the past. But as the sun began to set, he stumbled upon something unexpected. Half buried in the hillside, hidden behind a thicket of trees, he found the ruins of a stone structure. It was too robust for a temporary camp, too permanent. It wasn't mentioned in any of the project plans. It looked like a cellar or a holding area dug into the earth, reinforced with heavy stones. He approached cautiously, his heart pounding. The entrance was partially collapsed, blocked by debris. He managed to squeeze through a narrow opening, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The cellar was small, damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and decay. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, the floor covered in mud. The space was cramped and oppressive. And then he saw them. Embedded in the stone walls, rusted but still intact, were several large metal rings. Restraints. Vaughn froze, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. This wasn't a storage cellar. This was a prison. He raised his camera, the flash illuminating the grim scene. He photographed the rings, the walls, the entrance. The images were stark, brutal. He realized with a sickening certainty that this was connected to the rumors of forced labor. The realization sent a chill down his spine, the darkness of the cellar seeping into his soul. He scrambled out of the cellar, the darkness of the forest suddenly feeling menacing. He needed to get back to New York. He needed to show Paxton what he had found. The truth was buried here, and it was far more horrific than he had imagined. While Vaughn was navigating the wilderness of the Adirondacks, Kalin remained focused on the physical evidence back in the city. The barrels were the key, the tangible link between the murders and the killers. He needed to trace their origin, to find out who had ordered them, who had used them to seal the fate of 30 men. He stood in the forensic lab, surrounded by the blue-banded barrels. They were silent witnesses, their rusted surfaces holding the secrets of the past. He needed to make them speak. He brought in specialists, metallurgists, paint analysts, historians of industrial manufacturing. They meticulously examined the barrels, analyzing the composition of the metal, the chemical signature of the distinctive blue paint, and the faint manufacturing marks etched into the steel. The analysis revealed the barrels were manufactured in the late 1930s by Erie Steel Containers, a major supplier during that era. Kalin dispatched a team to Erie, Pennsylvania, where the company was once located. The factory was long gone, but the team managed to track down a retired employee, a man in his 90s who had worked in the sales department. The man's memory was fading, but he remembered the blue-banded barrels. They were a custom order. He even directed them to the original sales ledgers, archived in the local historical society. Kalin examined the digitized copies, his excitement growing as he scanned the faded entries. He found it, an order placed in August 1939, just weeks before the disappearance. A large order of 55-gallon barrels painted with the distinctive blue band. The purchaser was a transport company, Tri-State Hauling. Kalin cross-referenced the name with the 1939 case files. He recognized it instantly. Tri-State Hauling was the primary transport service for Adirondack Summit Development. The connection was clear, chilling. The killers had used their own transport company to dispose of the bodies. They had murdered the workers, packed them into the barrels, and transported them from the Adirondacks to Queens. It was a seamless, self-contained operation, minimizing the risk of exposure. But Kalin knew that tracing a company 65 years later would be difficult. Companies changed names, merged, or disappeared. He started searching for Tri-State Hauling in the modern databases, expecting another dead end. But to his surprise, the company still existed. It had been rebranded decades ago, modernized and expanded. It was no longer Tri-State Hauling, but TSH Logistics, a large, successful logistics company with hubs across the eastern seaboard. Kalin stared at the screen, the implications staggering. The company that had transported the bodies of the murdered workers was still in operation. The organization that had orchestrated the cover-up was still active, thriving, hidden in plain sight. He needed to find out who owned TSH Logistics, who controlled the company that had inherited the legacy of the 1939 murders. The cold case was heating up, the past colliding with the present with explosive force. The revelation that TSH Logistics was the modern incarnation of Tri-State Hauling electrified the investigation. The historical crime was now linked to a contemporary entity, a tangible target. Kalin started digging into TSH Logistics. On the surface, it was a legitimate, successful company with government contracts and a pristine corporate image. But Kalin knew that beneath the veneer lay a darker history. He needed to penetrate the layers of corporate obfuscation, the complex web of holding companies and subsidiaries that masked the true ownership. He traced the ownership structure following a labyrinthine trail of incorporation documents and financial disclosures. He finally reached the apex of the pyramid. TSH Logistics was wholly owned by a powerful private holding corporation, the Mercer Group. The name resonated with chilling familiarity. The Mercer Group, the family that owned Adirondack Summit Development in 1939, the organization that had orchestrated the mass murder and the cover-up. The Mercer Group was a powerhouse with interests in real estate, construction, logistics, and finance. They were one of the wealthiest families in New York, their name synonymous with power and privilege. Their influence extended into the highest echelons of society, their political connections vast and deep. The current CEO was Roman Mercer, the grandson of the man who founded the empire. The pieces clicked into place, forming a chilling picture of a vertically integrated criminal enterprise. The Mercer organization controlled everything. They owned the construction company that employed the workers. They owned the transport company that moved the bodies. And they owned the parking garage site in Queens, which records confirmed was also a Mercer development project in 1939. They had murdered the workers and buried them in the foundation of their own construction site, a seamless, efficient cover-up kept within the organization for 65 years. The organization that had murdered his grandfather was not just a historical artifact. It was a living, breathing entity, more powerful than ever. Kalin compiled his findings and presented the evidence to Captain Wallace, requesting authorization for deeper background checks, financial investigations, and surveillance on Roman Mercer and TSH Logistics. He expected support, but instead he encountered a wall of hesitation. "Kalin," Wallace said, leaning back in her chair, the tension in the room palpable. "You're making a big leap here, connecting a historical crime to a contemporary corporation based on a few rusty barrels and a 65-year-old sales ledger." "It's not just the barrels," Kalin argued, frustration mounting. "It's the ownership structure. The Mercer family controls everything. They had the motive, the means, and the opportunity." "Motive?" Wallace challenged. "Why kill 30 of their own workers?" "I don't know yet," Kalin admitted. But O'Malley's notebook mentioned organized activity, forced labor. They were doing something illegal in the Adirondacks, something the workers witnessed. "Speculation," Wallace dismissed. "We need proof, hard evidence." "How am I supposed to get proof if you won't let me investigate?" "Kalin, you need to understand who you're dealing with," Wallace said, her tone hardening. "The Mercer Group is not some street gang. They have immense political influence and deep connections within this department. We need an airtight case before we make a move. If we go after them prematurely, they will crush us." Wallace stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Focus on the historical aspect. Find the motive. Find the proof. Until then, the Mercer Group is off limits. Kalin left the office, a cold dread settling in his stomach. He recognized the same pattern of obstruction that had silenced Detective O'Malley 65 years ago. The corruption, it seemed, was still alive and well. He was fighting a war on two fronts, against the killers who had murdered his grandfather and against the system that was protecting them. Kalin knew the how, the meticulous planning, the cold efficiency of the disposal, the seamless cover-up. But the why remained elusive. Why kill 30 men? It was an extreme measure, even for organized crime. The risk was enormous. The secret they were protecting must have been equally massive. He retreated to his office, surrounded by the evidence. He pinned the 1939 photograph on the board, the faces of the workers staring back at him. They were honest men, trying to make a living during the depths of the Depression. What could they have possibly witnessed that was worth killing for? He revisited O'Malley's notebook, the cryptic references to organized activity and forced labor. He considered the historical context of the Great Depression, a time of desperation, exploitation, and shadow economies. And then the realization hit him, a sickening wave of understanding. Human trafficking. It fit the evidence. The remote location of the construction site, deep in the wilderness, a perfect waypoint for moving people discreetly. The transport company, Tri-State Hauling, providing the logistics. The marginalized workforce, easily exploited and silenced. The Mercer organization had used the chaos of the Depression to build their empire, trafficking people, likely women, for forced labor or prostitution. They had used the construction project as a cover, the remote site as a base of operations. The motive solidified. The workers had witnessed the trafficking operation. They had seen the victims, the brutality, the organization's darkest secret. During the hardship of the Depression, most might have looked away, too afraid to speak up. But as things stabilized, some of them, perhaps Bernard Paxton and Silas Griffin, men of conscience, tried to report it, and the Mercer organization silenced them. All of them, to protect their growing empire. They killed 30 men without hesitation, proving that human life was worthless compared to their profits. The brutality of the crime suddenly made sense. It wasn't just about silencing witnesses. It was about sending a message. Kalin felt a surge of anger. The victims weren't just casualties of a corporate cover-up. They were heroes who had paid the ultimate price for trying to expose the truth. He needed to prove it. But how? The crime occurred 65 years ago. He realized that the key might not be in the past, but in the present. The Mercer Group was still active. TSH Logistics was still operating. If the organization had been built on human trafficking, if they had been willing to commit mass murder to protect their operation, it was unlikely that they had simply stopped. Organized crime operations rarely dismantle themselves, especially when they are profitable and protected. The terrifying realization dawned on him. The trafficking operation might still be active. The historical investigation had just become an active conspiracy. Kalin knew he couldn't bring this theory to Wallace without proof. He needed evidence. He needed to catch them in the act. But how could one detective, isolated and constrained by the department, take on a multi-billion-dollar organization with a history of violence and impunity? The bureaucracy was a suffocating blanket. While Kalin wrestled with the department's inertia, Vaughn Griffin was drowning in frustration. Every day that passed felt like a betrayal of his grandfather's memory. Paxton was constrained by the badge, by Wallace's cautious maneuvering around the Mercer Group, but Vaughn felt no such limitations. The historical injustice was being repeated, and he refused to be a passive observer. He began his own surveillance on the TSH Logistics Distribution Hub, a sprawling complex in an industrial part of the city near the waterfront. It was a fortress, surrounded by a high fence topped with barbed wire, the air filled with the roar of engines and the hiss of hydraulics. He spent several nights parked in his car across the street, hidden in the shadows of an abandoned warehouse, watching the activity, documenting the routines, looking for anything unusual. It was tedious, exhausting work. The hours dragged on, but he was driven by a relentless need to expose the truth. The hub was busy, efficient, seemingly legitimate, but Vaughn knew that beneath the surface something sinister was lurking. Late one night, the atmosphere shifted. The security presence increased significantly. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements sharp, alert. The usual hustle slowed, the focus shifting to a secluded, internal loading bay, hidden from the view of the street. Vaughn's instincts screamed. This was it. He grabbed his digital camera with the zoom lens. He got out of his car, keeping to the shadows, moving closer to the perimeter fence. He found a vantage point behind a stack of pallets. The camera focused on the loading bay. A truck, unmarked and nondescript, was backed into the bay. A van arrived, pulling up next to the truck. The doors opened, and then he saw them. Several people were quickly and forcefully moved from the van into the truck. They were huddled together, their movements constrained, their faces obscured by the shadows. But Vaughn could see their fear, their desperation. They were not employees. They were prisoners. He realized with a horrific certainty that the trafficking operation never stopped. It just evolved. The Mercer organization was still in business. The realization sent a wave of nausea through him. He needed proof, irrefutable evidence that would force Kalin to act. He needed to get closer, to record the activity, to capture the faces of the victims. He moved stealthily, reaching the perimeter fence, his camera raised. But he was spotted. A security guard saw the glint of the camera lens. "Hey, you! Stop!" Vaughn froze. The guard raised his radio. Vaughn turned and ran, adrenaline surging. He scrambled back toward his car, the sound of shouting echoing behind him. He heard the roar of an engine. A car with TSH markings burst out of the gate, heading straight for him. He ducked into an alley, the car swerving, its headlights blinding him. He scrambled over a fence, tearing his jacket, cutting his hands. He kept running, the fear mixing with a desperate determination to survive. He knew if they caught him, he would disappear, just like his grandfather. He managed to escape, melting into the darkness of the industrial district. He was shaken, terrified, but also exhilarated. He had seen it. The Mercer organization was actively dangerous, and he was now in their crosshairs. Vaughn showed up at Kalin's apartment late that night, his eyes wild, his hands trembling, the cuts still bleeding. He frantically recounted the events at the TSH logistics hub, the secluded loading bay, the people being forced into the truck, the harrowing chase. Kalin listened, a cold dread spreading through his veins. Vaughn's testimony confirmed his darkest fears. This was no longer a cold case. It was an active conspiracy. "Vaughn, what the hell were you thinking?" Kalin exploded, pacing his living room, the anger fueled by concern. "You could have been killed. You could have compromised the entire investigation." "They're trafficking people, Kalin, right now, while we're sitting here waiting for warrants," Vaughn shot back, his voice raw. "We need to act. We can't let them get away with it again." "We will act, but we have to do it the right way. If we go off half-cocked, they will bury us." "The right way?" "The right way got 30 men killed in 1939, Vaughn shouted. "The right way allowed the Mercer Group to operate with impunity for 65 years. The right way is failing us." "I know that," Kalin shouted back, slamming his hand on the table. "But we have to be smart. We have to play the game better than they do." He looked at Vaughn, seeing the raw desperation. "Vaughn, this organization is lethal. They will not hesitate to eliminate anyone who threatens their operation. You need to stay out of this. Let me handle it." Vaughn reluctantly agreed, recognizing the danger he had put himself in. He left Kalin's apartment, the weight of the discovery heavy on his shoulders. Kalin spent the rest of the night formulating a plan. He needed to escalate the investigation to convince Wallace of the urgency. He would present Vaughn's testimony and demand a warrant to raid TSH Logistics. He had to try. The next morning, he walked to his car, his mind focused on the upcoming confrontation with Wallace. He reached his car, parked on the quiet street where he lived. And then he saw it. His windshield was smashed, a spiderweb of cracks radiating from a central impact point. The glass glittered on the pavement. His heart pounded. He approached the car cautiously, scanning the street. It was empty. He looked inside the car. On the dashboard, amidst the shattered glass, sat an object. An old tarnished work cap, a flat cap made of wool, faded and worn, identical to those worn by the men in the 1939 photograph. Calen froze. The blood drained from his face. It wasn't random vandalism. It was a message, a warning. The Mercer organization knew who he was. They knew what he was investigating. They knew about his connection to the murders, and they were threatening him with the same fate as his grandfather. The message was clear. Back off, or you're next. Buried, forgotten, erased. The threat was visceral, terrifying. It shattered his sense of security. He was not just investigating a criminal organization. He was at war with them. And they were fighting back, their reach extending into his own life, his own home. The threat against Calen galvanized his resolve. He was no longer just seeking justice for the past. He was fighting to stop an ongoing atrocity. The fear was still there, a cold knot in his stomach, but it was overshadowed by a burning anger. He stormed into Wallace's office and slammed the work cap on her desk. "They know," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "They know who I am. They threatened me. At my home." Wallace stared at the cap, her expression grim. "Calen, what happened?" He recounted the discovery of the smashed windshield and the symbolic message. He then presented Vaughn's testimony, the evidence of the active trafficking operation at TSH Logistics. "We need a warrant, Captain." "Now. We need to raid that hub. We need to stop them before they move those people." Wallace listened patiently, her face unreadable. When Calen finished, she leaned back in her chair, the silence stretching between them, heavy and oppressive. "Calen," she said slowly, her voice measured, devoid of emotion. "We cannot act based on this." "What do you mean?" Calen demanded, incredulous. "We have a credible witness, evidence of an ongoing criminal enterprise, a direct threat against a police officer. What more do you need?" "The witness is compromised," Wallace countered, her tone clipped, dismissive. "Vaughn Griffin is emotionally involved, biased. His testimony is unreliable. He was trespassing. He could be charged." "He witnessed human trafficking, Captain." "Allegedly. We have no corroborating evidence, no photos, no videos, just the word of a grieving grandson." "And the threat?" Calen pointed to the cap. "Is that alleged too?" "It's circumstantial. We have no proof that the Mercer organization is behind it. It could be anyone." Calen stared at her, stunned by the obstruction, the deliberate obfuscation. It was the same pattern as 1939, the same denial, the same protection of the powerful. "Captain," Calen said, his voice low and dangerous, "are you protecting them?" Wallace's eyes flashed with anger. "Be very careful what you say, Detective." "You're out of line." She ordered him to cease any investigation into the Mercer Group and TSH Logistics, restricting him to the historical aspect of the case. "If you disobey a direct order, I will suspend you," she warned. Calen left the office, his mind reeling. The bureaucratic wall was impenetrable. The corruption ran deeper than he had imagined. Wallace was either being pressured by higher-ups or she was actively compromised. It didn't matter. He was isolated. He couldn't trust his own department. If he wanted to stop the trafficking operation, he had to move outside the official chain of command. He had to go rogue. He needed leverage. He needed inside information. He needed a weak link in the organization's chain. He needed to find someone inside TSH Logistics who was willing to talk. Calen knew that finding an insider at TSH Logistics would be dangerous. The organization demanded loyalty, enforced by fear. But every organization had weak links, vulnerabilities that could be exploited. He started conducting discreet background checks on TSH Logistics employees, focusing on the drivers and warehouse workers. He searched for financial troubles, criminal records, disciplinary issues. He identified a potential target, Xander Yates, a truck driver with the company for 5 years. Yates had severe financial troubles stemming from a gambling addiction and a history of disciplinary issues. He was vulnerable and desperate. Kalen conducted surveillance on Yates, learning his routines. He found him at a rundown bar in the industrial district, a place where TSH workers gathered after their shifts. Kalen approached him discreetly in the dimly lit back alley behind the bar. "Xander Yates?" Kalen said, stepping out of the shadows. Yates turned, startled, his eyes widening in fear when Kalen showed him his badge. "I'm Detective Paxton. I need to talk to you." Yates recognized the name. Kalen knew the Mercer Group would have circulated internal security briefings about the investigation. "I don't know nothing," Yates said, his voice trembling. "I ain't done nothing wrong." "I'm not here about your debts, Xander," Kalen said, his voice low and steady. "I'm here about TSH Logistics. I'm here about the special shipments." Yates froze. "I don't know what you're talking about." Kalen pressed him. "I know about the 1939 murders, Xander. I know about the 30 men buried in the barrels. I know what this organization is capable of." He emphasized the fate of those who crossed them, the danger Yates was in just by being associated with them. "They don't care about you. You're disposable. If they think you're a liability, they will eliminate you." Yates broke down. The fear, the desperation, the weight of the secret he carried, it was too much. He confessed. He admitted to knowing about the special shipments. He didn't know what the cargo was, he claimed, but he knew it was illegal and dangerous. "They're handled off the books," Yates whispered. "High security. We get paid extra, in cash." The shipments were overseen by Jonah Tate, the head of security for TSH Logistics, a man known for his brutality and loyalty to the Mercer Group. "Tate is a monster," Yates said, his eyes filled with fear. "He runs the operation." Kalen needed actionable intelligence. "I need your help, Xander. I need you to give me the schedule for the next special shipment." Yates hesitated, the fear of retaliation warring with the hope of escape. Kalen offered him protection, promising confidentiality and relocation. Yates finally agreed. The next special shipment was scheduled for the following night. He provided the details of the protocol, the location of the secluded loading bay, the timing of the operation. Kalen left the alley, the information burning in his mind. He had the key. He had the opportunity to expose the organization, but he also knew the risks. He was operating outside the law, without backup, without authorization. If he failed, he would be destroyed. Kalen stood at the precipice. He had the intel, the schedule for the next trafficking shipment, a chance to expose the Mercer Group and the corruption that shielded them. But he also knew he wouldn't get official authorization. Wallace had made it clear that the Mercer Group was untouchable. If he went through official channels, the evidence would be buried, the operation tipped off, and the victims would disappear. He had to act unilaterally. The choice was agonizing. Break the law to uphold it, risk his career and his life to deliver justice. The thought of the operation continuing, echoing the injustice of 1939, was unbearable. He needed help. He couldn't do this alone. He called Vaughn. "I have the schedule," Kalen said, his voice low. "The next shipment is tomorrow night." Vaughn understood immediately. "What's the plan?" "We infiltrate the TSH Logistics hub during the shipment. We obtain video evidence, irrefutable proof." Kalen emphasized, anticipating Vaughn's reaction. "We cannot rescue the victims ourselves." "It's too dangerous. but we can ensure their rescue by exposing the truth." Vaughn agreed, his voice tight with determination. "I'm in. Whatever it takes." They met at an abandoned warehouse near the industrial district. They spent the day preparing, planning, strategizing. Kalin studied the layout of the hub provided by Yates, the blueprints, the security protocols, the blind spots. They gathered equipment, night vision cameras, bolt cutters, dark clothing, burner phones. The tools of the trade now used against the organization they were supposed to be fighting. The tension was agonizing. They were about to cross the line, to enter the belly of the beast. Kalin looked at Vaughn. They were united by a shared trauma, a common purpose. They were the descendants of the victims, fighting the same battle their grandfathers had fought 65 years ago. As night fell, the city lights casting long shadows, Kalin felt a cold determination. This was the point of no return, the desperate gambit that would either expose the truth or bury them with it. They moved out, disappearing into the darkness, heading toward the TSH Logistics hub. The fate of the victims, the legacy of their grandfathers, rested on their shoulders. The TSH Logistics hub sprawled across several acres of industrial waterfront, a fortress of concrete and steel illuminated by the harsh glare of floodlights. The air hummed with the sound of idling trucks and the metallic clang of moving containers. Kalin and Vaughn approached the perimeter fence from the rear, the side facing the murky waters of the river. The darkness provided some cover, but the security patrols were frequent. "Now," Kalin whispered as a security vehicle passed. They moved quickly. Kalin used the bolt cutters to cut through the chain-link fence, the sound masked by the roar of a passing truck. They slipped through the opening, disappearing into the shadows of the complex. They were inside. Adrenaline surged through Kalin, his senses heightened, his training kicking in. He moved stealthily, keeping to the blind spots, using the stacks of shipping containers as cover. Vaughn followed closely, tense but determined. They navigated the maze of the complex, dodging security patrols and avoiding surveillance cameras. The tension was agonizing, every shadow a potential threat, every sound amplified in the quiet night. They reached the main warehouse complex, a massive structure housing the internal loading bays. They needed to find the secluded bay identified by Yates. They slipped through an unlocked side door. The interior was vast, cavernous, filled with rows of towering shelves stacked with cargo. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust. They found the secluded loading bay at the far end of the warehouse. It was quiet, dimly lit, waiting. Kalin spotted a metal catwalk suspended above the loading bay, used for maintenance access. They climbed the narrow stairs and reached the catwalk, crouching low, concealed by the metal grating and the shadows. They had a clear view of the bay below. They waited, the minutes stretching into an eternity. The silence was heavy, oppressive. And then they heard it. The sound of an engine approaching. The protocol had begun. Kalin raised the night vision camera, his hand steady. Jonah Tate emerged from the shadows, clipboard in hand. He was a large, muscular man, his face scarred, his eyes cold. He was accompanied by several heavily armed men. The atmosphere shifted, the air crackling with tension. The security increased, the men taking positions around the loading bay. This was it, the moment of truth. The large, unmarked truck backed into the loading bay, the sound of the engine echoing in the vast space. The doors were sealed, the cargo hidden. A dark, windowless van arrived shortly after and pulled up to the loading bay. The doors slid open. Kalin focused the night vision camera, the greenish glow illuminating the scene below. He watched, his breath catching in his throat as the horrific confirmation unfolded. Several young women were forced out of the van, their hands bound, their mouths gagged. They were terrified, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. The scene was brutal, efficient, devoid of humanity. Tate oversaw the operation with cold detachment, his men handling the women like cargo, pushing them toward the truck. Kalin felt a wave of nausea. This was the reality of human trafficking. The exploitation, the violence, the dehumanization. He realized with a sickening certainty that this was exactly what his grandfather had witnessed 65 years ago. The organization's cruelty hadn't changed. Vaughn was trembling beside him, his face contorted in a mask of rage and grief. He was watching the echo of the past, the continuation of the tragedy that had shattered his family. Kalin kept him focused, a restraining hand on his arm. They needed the evidence. They watched as the women were forced into a concealed compartment within the long-haul truck, a hidden space designed to smuggle human cargo. A modern-day version of the barrels. The truck doors were being sealed. Kalin had the evidence, the irrefutable proof. And then it happened. A small mistake, a fatal error. Vaughn shifted his weight, trying to get a better angle, his foot slipping on the metal grating of the catwalk. A piece of loose metal groaned loudly under his weight. It clattered on the concrete floor below, the sound amplified in the silence of the warehouse. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Tate and his men looked up, their eyes snapping toward the catwalk. They saw the movement, the shadows. The alarm was raised. The warehouse erupted into chaos. "They're up there!" Tate shouted, pointing toward the catwalk. "Get them!" Kalin and Vaughn scrambled to their feet, their hearts hammering. They were exposed, trapped. They had the evidence. Now they had to survive. Gunshots erupted from below, the bullets ricocheting off the metal catwalk, sparks flying in the darkness. Kalin and Vaughn fled across the narrow platform, the metal grating vibrating beneath their feet. "Move!" Kalin shouted, pushing Vaughn forward. They reached the end of the catwalk, the stairs leading down, blocked by Tate's men. They were trapped. Kalin scanned the area, his tactical training kicking in. He needed a diversion. He saw the transformer box on the wall near the loading bay. He raised his weapon and fired, the bullet hitting the box, sparks erupting in a shower of light. The warehouse plunged into darkness, the sudden silence broken only by shouts of confusion and the emergency lights kicking in, bathing the space in an eerie red glow. Kalin grabbed Vaughn's arm. "This way." They scrambled down a maintenance ladder, dropping to the warehouse floor. They were now in the maze of the warehouse, the towering shelves offering cover. The chase was on. A tense cat-and-mouse game through the darkness, the red light casting long shadows, the sound of footsteps echoing around them. Kalin moved stealthily, using his knowledge of the layout. He created diversions, knocking over stacks of cargo, activating the sprinkler system, the water raining down, adding to the chaos. They were close to the exit, but Tate was waiting for them. He emerged from the shadows, his face illuminated by the red light, his eyes burning with rage. He raised his weapon. "End of the line, Detective," Tate snarled. Kalin pushed Vaughn behind a stack of crates. "It's over, Tate. We have the evidence. The whole operation is on camera." Tate laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think that matters? We own this city." He lunged forward, attacking Kalin with brutal force. The fight was desperate, visceral. Tate was a monster, fueled by rage. He fought dirty, using his size and strength to overpower Kalin. They crashed into a stack of shelves, the cargo raining down around them. Kalin lost his weapon, the gun skittering across the concrete floor. Tate pinned him down, his hands wrapped around Kalin's throat, squeezing the life out of him. Kalin struggled, his vision blurring, the darkness closing in. Suddenly, Vaughn emerged from the shadows, a metal pipe in his hand. He swung the pipe with all his strength, hitting Tate in the back of the head. Tate roared in pain, releasing his grip. He stumbled back, dazed. Kalin gasped for air, scrambling to his feet. He grabbed his weapon, aiming it at Tate. Tate was about to charge again when the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The local police, likely corrupt, called by Mercer's team. They had to get out. Kalin and Vaughn ran toward the exit, bursting through the door into the cold night air. They escaped into the industrial district, disappearing into the maze of the city streets just as the police cars arrived at the warehouse. They got away. With the cameras. With the evidence? With their lives? They didn't stop running until they were miles away from the TSH logistics hub, the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion. They had survived. They had the evidence. But the war was far from over. Calen knew he couldn't go back to his precinct. Wallace was compromised. The evidence would be buried, and they would disappear, just like the 30 men in 1939. He needed to bypass the corrupted chain of command, to take the evidence directly to someone he could trust, someone outside the Mercer Group's influence. He knew exactly who to call. Agent Marcus Thorne, FBI Organized Crime Division, a man Calen had worked with, a man whose integrity was beyond reproach. He called Thorne. "Marcus, it's Calen Paxton. I need your help." "Calen? What's going on? Heard you were in hot water. You sound like hell." "It's complicated. I have evidence, irrefutable proof of a major human trafficking operation connected to the Mercer Group and corruption within the NYPD." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. Thorne knew the implications. "Where are you?" Thorne gave him an address, a safe house in Brooklyn. Calen drove, the city lights blurring past them. They arrived at the safe house, Thorne waiting for them, his face etched with concern. Calen handed over the camera. He then presented his entire case file, the historical connection, the evidence of the Mercer Group's criminal enterprise, the obstruction from Wallace. Thorne reviewed the evidence, his expression hardening. He watched the video, the horrific scene unfolding on the screen. He looked at Calen, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. "Calen," he said, his voice tight with rage, "this is explosive. This is bigger than anything we've ever handled. The Mercer Group, the NYPD corruption, the historical murders. It's a powder keg." "I know. They've been operating with impunity for 65 years. "Not anymore," Thorne promised, his voice resolute. "We will take it from here. We will bring them down. All of them." Calen felt a wave of relief. The burden he had carried alone finally lifted. He knew his career might be over, but he also knew he had done the right thing. He had exposed the truth and honored the memory of his grandfather. The FBI acted swiftly. Thorne mobilized his team, coordinating with the Department of Justice, securing warrants, planning the operation. By morning, the storm broke. The news channels were reporting a major law enforcement operation unfolding across the city. Details were initially vague, confirming a raid on a major logistics company, arrests made, victims rescued. The reckoning had begun. The Mercer Organization, the untouchable empire, was about to fall. The pre-dawn air was crisp, the silence of the city broken only by the distant wail of sirens. Agent Marcus Thorne stood at the command post, a mobile unit parked blocks away from the TSH logistics hub. He was in charge of a large-scale, multi-agency raid, a coordinated strike against the heart of the Mercer Organization. The operation involved dozens of agents from the FBI, Homeland Security, and the Department of Justice. The NYPD, Calen's precinct specifically, was excluded. The corruption ran too deep. "All teams in position," the radio crackled in his ear. "Execute," Thorne ordered, his voice calm, the adrenaline surging. The operation began simultaneously at multiple locations. At the TSH Logistics Hub, the FBI tactical team breached the perimeter, their movements swift and precise. They secured the warehouse complex, overwhelming the personnel. The truck containing the victims was intercepted before it could leave the state. The hidden compartment was opened, the women rescued, their faces pale with fear, but alive. Jonah Tate, still recovering from the fight with Calen and Vaughn, was arrested at the scene. He was defiant, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was led away in handcuffs, his reign of terror finally over. At the Mercer Group headquarters in Midtown Manhattan, agents raided the corporate offices, seizing financial records, communication data, and servers. They found the evidence that linked the modern operation back to the historical roots of the organization, The decades of illicit profits, the web of corruption. At Roman Mercer's penthouse apartment, the arrest team breached the door. They found Mercer in his study, seemingly unperturbed. His arrogance was staggering. He was arrested, his political influence unable to stop the federal intervention. He was led away, his face a mask of disbelief and rage, the untouchable finally brought to justice. The news of the raid spread like wildfire. The city was stunned. At the NYPD precinct, Internal Affairs arrived. Captain Daria Wallace was suspended, pending investigation, her career over, her complicity exposed. The silence that had protected the organization for decades was finally broken. Thorne watched the sunrise over the city, a sense of grim satisfaction settling over him. The operation was a success. The victims were safe. The monsters were in custody. Thanks to the courage of one detective, the truth had finally been brought to light. Weeks turned into months. The aftermath of the raids was a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media frenzy, and internal investigations. Kalin was placed on administrative leave, pending review. Agent Thorne kept his promise. He protected Kalin, presenting him as a whistleblower. The review board, faced with the undeniable evidence of corruption and the success of the operation, cleared Kalin of any wrongdoing. His badge was restored. The site of the parking garage in Queens was consecrated. The demolition was halted, the area transformed into a permanent memorial for the 30 men who had been buried there. The forensic investigation confirmed Bernard Paxton's remains were among those found. The confirmation brought a bittersweet closure to Kalin's family. Kalin stood at the memorial, the names of the 30 men etched deep into black granite. He found his grandfather's name with his fingertips, Bernard Paxton. The stone was cold, permanent in a way the man himself never got to be. Vaughn pushed Otis Griffin's wheelchair across the gravel path, and the elderly man struggled to stand when they reached the monument, needing to touch his father's name, Silas Griffin, carved just 3 names below Bernard. "They're together," Otis said, his voice breaking. "After all this time, they're still together." The 3 men stood in silence, 3 generations bound by a tragedy that had shaped their families before any of them were born. For the first time in 65 years, the weight of not knowing had lifted. Otis placed a hand on Kalin's shoulder, his eyes filled with tears, but also a sense of peace. "You found him, Detective. You brought him home. You gave us back our history." "I'm sorry it took so long," Kalin said, his voice thick with emotion. "It doesn't matter," Otis said. "What matters is that the truth is finally out, that those monsters are finally paying for their crimes." For the first time in his life, he felt peace. The wound that had festered for 65 years had finally begun to heal. Vaughn looked at Kalin, a newfound respect in his eyes. "You did it, Kalin. You broke the cycle. You ended their reign of terror." Kalin looked at the memorial. He felt a deep connection to his grandfather, a shared purpose. He had fought for justice in 1939, and now, 65 years later, his grandson had finished the fight. The investigation had changed him. It had tested his limits and forced him to confront the darkness beneath the surface of the city. But he had also seen the best of humanity, the courage, the determination, the resilience. It had also given him a renewed sense of purpose, a realization that uncovering the truth, no matter how long buried, gave meaning to his work. The long arc of justice had finally bent toward the light. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest, their voices finally heard. The trials of Roman Mercer and Jonah Tate were high profile, a media spectacle that exposed the full scope of the Mercer organization's history. The courtroom was packed every day, the testimonies revealing the sordid details of the trafficking operation. The prosecution presented a devastating case. The rescued victims bravely recounted their horrific experiences. Xander Yates, under witness protection, testified against the organization, providing the crucial insider information. Kalin testified, his testimony crucial in linking the 1939 murders to the organization's motive of silencing witnesses. He presented the evidence he had gathered, the historical connection, the notes of Detective O'Malley, the video footage of the trafficking operation. The defense tried to discredit him, painting him as a rogue detective obsessed with a historical vendetta. But the truth was undeniable. The verdict? Guilty on all counts. Roman Mercer and Jonah Tate received multiple life sentences, their empire collapsing, their legacy destroyed. Several corrupt officials, including Captain Daria Wallace, were indicted for obstruction and conspiracy. The systemic corruption that had protected the organization for decades was exposed. Kalin returned to duty. He was hailed as a hero by some, criticized by others, but he remained the same meticulous, driven detective. He returned to his desk, the familiar surroundings grounding him. He hung the 1939 photograph in his office, the faded image a constant reminder of the lives lost and the justice achieved. The stern faces of the 30 men stared back at him, a testament to the enduring power of the truth. Kalin looked at the photograph, a sense of peace settling over him. The case was closed. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. But the memory remained, a reminder that no one is ever truly forgotten, that justice, no matter how long delayed, will eventually prevail.